Let's continue with exercise 5, this time working through numbers 54 through 72. Now I realize that you may not know the vocabulary or the lexical entries of these verbs, but I'll tell you what they are, and based upon that information, let's see what we can figure out. Number 54 is the verb ebaptisen. Well, you can already guess that that has to do with the verb to baptize, right? Ebaptisen. The lexical entry of this verb, and I will give this to you, is the verb baptizo. Is there an augment? Yes, there is an augment. And if there is an augment, then we're dealing with the indicative. Why? Because the augment shows past time, and only in the indicative is time an element. That also limits us to one of three tenses which can show past time: the imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect. Forget about pluperfect for the time being. Go to the back part of the verb and let's identify the ending back here. Well, technically it's not an ending. Technically it is just a connecting vowel and a movable nu. But we will think of it as an ending, this epsilon nu, and it is the third singular. Is it an active ending or is it a middle passive ending? Well, all we have learned so far are just the active endings, and yes, it is an active ending. We've already identified the connecting vowel of epsilon. Is there a tense indicator? Yes, a sigma tense indicator. Of the two tenses, imperfect and aorist, which one has a sigma tense indicator? That's right, the aorist. So the parsing of this verb is aorist, active, indicative, third singular. A provisional translation: start with your person and number, he, she, or it, and the aorist indicative is simple past time, baptized, or has baptized, or did baptize. He, she, or it has baptized. Now, I wonder what has happened to the zeta in this verb. You see, the present tense stem of this verb ends in the consonant zeta. Again, how do we get the present tense stem of a verb? We take the lexical entry, we take the personal ending and remove it, and what we're left with is the present tense stem. Well, what has happened is that if you take the present tense stem, baptides, and if we insert a sigma tense indicator, what will happen is that the zeta followed by sigma disappears. It elides. There is a chart in section 1 of your grammar on phonology that explains what happens when certain consonants are followed by sigma. Let me refer you to that chart. If you'll look back in section 1, on page 1-6, at the bottom of the page, of page 1-6, you will see a little chart that tells you what happens when certain letters combine with sigma. Okay, let's look at another one. Number 56. Number 56 is baptise. All All right, our lexical entry is the same as number 54, baptizo. Is there an augment? No, there's not. Let's go to the back part of the verb and identify this ending, epsilon iota. Well, that's a third person singular ending. We see in front of it a tense indicator of sigma. We know that there's no reduplication out front. A sigma tense indicator, it's not past time, that must be future. We also know that this ending, besides being third singular, is an active indicative ending because we have memorized it as such. Future active indicative third singular. Translating this would be he, she, or it, your third singular, and now future time, will baptize. He will baptize. She will baptize. Look at number 57. Ebaptizen. Our lexical entry, again, is baptizo. Is there an augment? Yes, there is an augment. And if there is an augment, first thing we write down is indicative. Why? Because the augment shows past time, and only in the indicative is time an element. That limits us to one of three tenses which can show past time: the imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect. Go to the back part of the verb and let's identify the ending. Again, this is not a real ending. It's an epsilon connecting vowel and a movable nu, but we are already thinking of this as a third singular ending, and it is also an active ending. We've already identified the connecting vowel as epsilon. Is there a tense indicator here? No, there's not. We see that zeta left over from the present tense stem. What is the present tense stem of the verb baptizo? Baptiz. We have an augment plus the present tense stem and no tense indicator. What tense is that? That's right, it's the imperfect. Imperfect, active, indicative, third singular. And to translate this, we would start with our third singular. He, she, or it was baptizing. Remember, the imperfect tense generally shows continuation in past time. So he, she, or it was baptizing. Let's now look at number 59. Ebaptisemen. Our lexical entry is still the verb baptizo. Is there an augment? Yes, there is. So the first thing we write down is indicative. We also know that we're working with either the imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect. Let's go to the back part of the verb and identify the ending men, first plural. We know that that is also an active ending. We look in front of the ending and we see an alpha connecting vowel, and then we also see a sigma tense indicator. Of the two tenses, imperfect and aorist, which one of those two has a sigma tense indicator and an alpha connecting vowel? Sigma alpha. The aorist does. So our parsing is aorist, active, indicative, first plural. The first plural would be we, and the aorist indicative shows simple past time. we baptized, or we have baptized, or we did baptize. Look at number 60. Bebaptikate. Bebaptikate. Is there an augment? Or first we should say, what is the lexical entry? It's still the verb baptizo. Now, is there an augment? No. But what do we have happening in front here? Reduplication, where the initial consonant of the verb is repeated up front, separated with this epsilon vowel for pronunciation. What tense is reduplicated? That's right, the perfect tense. Let's go to the back part of the verb and identify our personal ending, second plural. And in front of that we have an alpha connecting vowel and a kappa tense indicator. By the way, we also know that that ending is an active indicative ending, don't we? And now with a kappa tense indicator, we are also confirmed that this is a perfect tense, perfect active indicative second plural, and the translation then would be, you have baptized. You have baptized. Now let's look at number 63. Ekusate. I will tell you that the lexical entry of this verb is akuo. We get the English word acoustics from this word. Akuo means I hear. Now, notice that this verb begins with a vowel. If we ask, is there an augment? What we would look for is not an epsilon out front, but rather that this initial vowel has lengthened to show augmentation. If you will turn back to section 1 of your grammar, and look at page 1-9. You'll see a chart that shows what happens when vowels lengthen for augmentation. Look what happens when an alpha lengthens for augmentation. It lengthens to an eta. What happens when an omicron lengthens for augmentation? It lengthens to an omega, and so forth. So, do we have an augment in front of this verb, ekusate? Yes, we do. The alpha has lengthened to an eta. So we do have an augment. The first thing we write down is indicative. Why? Because the augment shows past time, and only in the indicative is time an element. And that limits us to one of three tenses which can show past time: the imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect. Forget pluperfect. Now let's go to the back part of the verb and identify our personal ending, te. What person and number is te? Well, it's 2p. It is also an active ending. We look in front of the ending and we see an alpha connecting vowel and a sigma tense indicator. Of the two tenses, imperfect and aorist, which one has a sigma tense indicator and an alpha connecting vowel? Aorist. So our parsing is aorist, active, indicative, second plural. A provisional translation, we start with our second plural, you, or you all, And then the aorist indicative is simple past time. You heard, or you have heard, or you did hear. Let's take a look at another, number 64, from this same verb, akuo. Akusen. The lexical entry is akuo, I hear. Is there an augment? Yes, there is. How do we know that? Well, the verb begins with an alpha, a vowel. And when a verb begins with a vowel, that verb is augmented to show past time by lengthening the vowel. And according to our chart on page 1-8, we can see that an alpha lengthens to an eta. So yes, we do have an augment. That means the verb is indicative. Why? Because the augment shows past time, and only in the indicative is time an element. That limits us to one of three tenses which can show past time. What are they? The imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect. Forget pluperfect. Now, go to the back part of the verb and identify your personal ending. Again, remember, this is not really an ending, but rather it is an epsilon connecting vowel and a movable nu. But we are thinking of it as an ending, third singular. It is also an active ending. We look in front of the ending and we see a sigma tense indicator. Of the two verbs, imperfect or aorist, which one would have a sigma tense indicator? Aorist. So our parsing, aorist, active indicative, third singular. The translation would be he, she, or it. Now the aorist indicative is simple past time. He, she, or it has heard, or did hear, or he, she, or it heard. Okay, let's take a look at number 65. Akuse. What is our lexical entry? It is akuo. Is there an augment? No, there is no augment. So that means we're not working with a past time verb, but rather we would be working with the present tense, the future tense, or the perfect tense. If we were working with the perfect tense, we would have to see some reduplication out front. Now, when a verb begins with a vowel, the verb reduplicates by lengthening that vowel just as though it were an augment. So if there were reduplication out front, we would have to see an eta here. But there is none. It's just an alpha. So we're either working with the present tense or the future tense. Let's go to the back part of the verb and identify our personal ending. That epsilon iota ending is third singular, and it is an active indicative ending. How do we know that? Well, we have memorized our active indicative endings, or at least we hope we have. And then we see that there's a sigma tense indicator in front of the ending. Of the two tenses, present and future, which one has a sigma tense indicator? That's right, the future tense. So the parsing is future, active, indicative, third singular. Provisional translation would be he, she, or it will hear. He will hear. She will hear. Now let's look at number 66. The verb is echomen. Echomen. The lexical entry of this verb is the verb echo. Echo. Sometimes you'll hear me pronounce the key more in the back part of my mouth, and I will usually pronounce this word echo. Echo. But to say echo is fine for right now. Notice that this verb begins with an epsilon vowel. This verb, by the way, means I have or I hold. So is there an augment in the verb form that we're parsing? No, there's not. If there were, this epsilon would have to lengthen to show augment. And it has not lengthened here in any way to show augment. So we're not working with the past tense here. We're working with either the present, the future, or the perfect. If this verb were in the perfect tense, what would have to happen to this initial vowel to show reduplication? Well, it would have to lengthen, wouldn't it? Just as though there were an augment. So we have no reduplication out front here. So we know we're working with either the present or the future. Now let's go to the back part of the verb. We identify our ending men as first plural. We also know that that is an active, indicative ending. And do we have any kind of a tense indicator, such as a sigma, to indicate the future? No, we don't. So between the present and the future, this would be the present tense. Present, active, indicative, first plural. And a provisional translation, start with your first plural, we have, or we are having. Are we having fun yet? Okay. Let's look at number 68. Now, the lexical entry of this verb is grapho. Grapho means I write. We get our English word graphics from this word. Is there an augment? Yes, there is an augment, so the first thing we write is indicative. Why? Because the augment shows past time, and only in the indicative is time an element. That limits us to one of three tenses which can show past time. They are the imperfect, the aorist, or the pluperfect. Forget pluperfect. Go to the back part of the verb and identify your ending te. 2p, second person, plural. Is that an active ending or a middle passive ending? It's an active ending. That's all we have learned so far. We look in front of the ending and we see an alpha connecting vowel. And then in front of that we see a psi. I wonder what's happened here. Well, if we take our verb grapho and the present tense stem is graph, and we take that stem, and if we add a sigma to that stem, what happens when phi meets up with sigma? Well, according to page 1-6, when a labial such as a phi is combined with sigma, we get a psi. So there is a sigma here. The phi and the sigma have combined together to make a psi. So we do have a sigma tense indicator and an alpha connecting vowel. So our tense now is aorist. aorist active indicative, second person plural. A provisional translation would be, you wrote, or you have written, or you did write.